All right, we'll start with D.1 on the public hearing. Kyra?
So we call the item D1 is a public hearing. Consider the request of the City of Granbury to amend select sections of the City of Granbury zoning ordinance pertaining to the addition of short-term rentals. Amendments proposed are to Section 4.1A, uses permitted by district, Section 4.2, Supplemental Standards for land uses, Section 11.2D, parking table, and Section 2.3, land use definitions. So the background on this is that early this year, staff was directed to prepare amendments to the bed and breakfast ordinance requirements. There's been an influx of short-term rentals, which we probably all have recognized. These have occurred in residential neighborhoods, primarily near the downtown and tourist-oriented areas. We've studied the topic, and this project or this item is the result of that study and analysis of the city's existing ordinance, comparable city allowances, and recent court decisions. I'd like to point out that staff is recommending a continuance of this project to the June 13th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting so that we can further evaluate what's being proposed. Typically, you know, we have an approval or recommendation or a denial recommendation. We'd like to get it right, and so that's why we're suggesting a continuance would be a best point to consider. So going on with the background, this, as we've stated, has been studied in the courts. The courts have found that a bed and breakfast use, which now the current vernacular is a short-term rental. So the courts have found that short-term rentals are indeed a residential use, and they have found that if appropriately regulated, they should be located in not only commercial areas but also residential areas and communities. So what we did in our research, we modeled our recommendations after the Arlington case, which was the last one that has been through the court system. And that one was approved to have certain geographic areas of the community within which short-term rentals could be allowed. The other requirements can include a permitting system, which we would recommend also, and we've prepared text for that, as well as the zoning ordinance can partner with that. So to go back to the presentation and keep this a little bit orderly, the current City of Granbury regulations for bed and breakfast is located in the zoning ordinance, and it is titled as bed and breakfast. It's permitted to operate by right in all non-residential districts, as well as in residential districts with a specific use provision. So the non-residential don't need to go through a public meeting, while the ones in a residential district do need a public meeting. And there are standards that are required: supplemental land use standards, parking requirements, signage, architectural design, and life safety requirements. So in our past, from 2001 to 2021, there have been 68 bed and breakfast SUPs approved. And of those, 47 were approved between 16 and 21. So that's a recent uptick in the number of those that have been approved. 69% of the bed and breakfasts have been approved in the last 5 years. And this is a map showing the locations of those approvals. This is cumulative approved SUPs through 2021. And not all of these as short-term rentals, I'm starting to transition to use the proper term, short-term rentals, depicted are currently active. So you'll see one there to the south of the 377, Highway 377, that little pink dot. That one's not active, but it had been approved. And there have been 3 specific use provisions, special use permits, approved in 2022 for short-term rentals. The graph there at the bottom right of your screen just demonstrates that uptick in requests and approvals. So we researched 8 regional municipalities regarding short-term regulation, and the findings are tabulated in the report. But in summary, the approach to regulations does vary from city to city. Each city is unique and needs its own regulations, but there are certain guidelines that the courts and the laws give to us. So again, zoning districts, geographic areas where they are permitted with supplemental land use standards on the issuance of some form of permit or license, or a special use permit and a permit, which is equivalent to a license. And some have been or are currently being litigated. Some cities in the state still do have some litigation on short-term rental. I reviewed the Arlington case. This is just a list of some of those things that we find that are codified. Requires local contact, available 24-hour basis for emergency complaints. And some standards in the regulations also include a statement that person or contact be available within an hour of the subject site. I've noticed one regulation that allowed 2 hours. I think we've typically in our hearings we hear the question, how far is that contact from the property? Non-transferable permit, if the owner sells the property, the new owner would have to get a new permit. Occupancy limits on the number of people that can be in the short-term rental as a guest. Assembly time limits, permit required for each unit, restricted to hosted only with certain geographic areas, unhosted in other geographic areas. Second floor occupancy with central business districts, and not permitted within residential zoning. That is an option, though we did not prepare our proposal in that direction. So the concept that we've proposed as a draft, emphasis on draft right now is for consideration, is to modernize the language from bed and breakfast to short-term rental. And we actually have 4 different definitions of bed and breakfast right now. We're proposing to streamline that and make it a little more simple and easier to use, and just have 3 definitions: short-term rental hosted, short-term rental residential unhosted, short-term rental commercial. So those are the 3 types then. And move regulatory language out of definitions into supplementary standards, specifically the number of guest rooms. The definitions should clearly define the use. It can be challenging to separate the defined use from regulatory language, but we always do our best to complete that exercise. Provide greater clarity of the supplemental standard for each class of short-term rental. Right now we had 2 supplementary standards for those 4 uses, and we're proposing 1 supplementary standard for each class of use. So not just 1 standard, there's a whole list of standards, but I think you understand what I'm trying to get at. Correct the numbering for the short-term residential hosted and in the residential districts and permitted in the central business district, and correct numbering. So a little bit of cleanup with correct numbering. Realign the parking for clarity. So this is the chart that is in the staff report. The top line out there should be struck through, and then it would be the bottom 3 uses proposed for parking standards. Each room that would be rented is required to have 1 parking space, so that's 1 parking space for each guest unit. And then if there is a management or it is a hosted facility, then there should be 2 parking spaces for that management or for the host. So if it's a house, our standard rate of parking is 2 parking spaces for that house. if the people that live there are the hosts, then those 2 parking spaces are for them. And then the people that come and are the guests, if it's got 2 units, you would have 2 parking spaces for those 2 guests, right? Okay. Further, evaluation and modification of parking, we just went over that. Permitting and enforcement additions, this was something we modeled after the Arlington regulations. It basically requires a permitting for safety provisions, and also it's another mechanism to assure that the use runs per our codes, and if it's not, then there are penalties different compared to a specific use provision. No rental less than 18 hours. That helps to minimize the potential for nefarious activities. Trash placement control, so that the trash is out for collection, but not out for extended or long periods of time. Mentioned the local management within a 1-hour time frame. Expiration of a permit if it's not renewed. And geographic area where the short-term rentals might locate to be in the historic preservation and historic compatibility overlay districts. And this map shows on the right side, the pink is the historic preservation overlay district, and the blue color is the historic compatibility overlay. There's a green line in there that shows the central business district. And I'd like to explain why we show that on this slide. The comprehensive plan is our policy document. It guides our decisions. In that document, it does mention bed and breakfast, and it suggests that the CBD would be one area where bed and breakfast would be appropriate. It also suggests that near to the downtown and historic area, bed and breakfast would be appropriate. So when we look to where have specific use permits been permitted or allowed, those blue and pink dots are shown on the left map. And so those areas where they're already permitted closely parallels much of the historic preservation overlay and the historic compatibility overlay. You'll see some of the blue dots to the left of Morgan are outside of those 2 districts. So in that area outside of the district, there are 2 non-compliant, actually I should mention there's one, it's kind of hard to see, but it's south of the Highway 377, and there's another one that is west of Morgan. So 2 non-compliant outside of the historic districts and 5 compliant outside of the historic districts. It could be an option to expand the historic districts to capture those. If that action was not taken, then those would become non-conforming. Of course, we know with our specific use permits, they do not time out, and they do run with the land. So they would be subject to their existing specific use permit requirements. Okay. Then we have the 3 documents that I mentioned, the zoning ordinance amendment, the permitting and enforcement additions, and then throughout the city code there are other references to bed and breakfast, which we would just change the nomenclature for that. So that's why there's 3 documents attached to your staff report. So a few key considerations. The draft proposed is in consideration of the research findings included in the staff report, and in the proposed ordinance this slide just summarizes those items that I've already gone through, so I'm not going to read through each and every one of them. Staff is recommending continuing the project at this time to the next P&Z meeting. We would like to look at a better alignment of definitions for guest room, guest unit, and rooms to add a definition of exactly what that means. It can be confusing right now today. We do have some references in the code that help to clarify what that is. When we say guest room, that is one room that is intended for rental in a bed and breakfast. Often we hear a 2-guest suite. When someone comes in with an application, they say, I'd like to have a 2-guest suite. So what that means is they have 2 bedrooms that they're letting in that residence for the purpose of the bed and breakfast. And then consider adding a definition for lodging. We don't have a lodging definition. It seems very common of a term, but it helps to have very much clarity in a code. And finally, consider a review of the 50-party guests in hosted short-term rentals and the 14 in unhosted short-term rentals. Here in Granbury, at least I'm not aware that there are parties that have gotten out of hand. There may be, I haven't heard of them, but in some cities there are parties that have gotten out of hand at short-term rentals. And initially staff, we didn't have concern of that, and then when we started thinking about it a little more, we thought maybe we should at least have a conversation and bring that out for a conversation. So our voting options would be to continue the item to June 13, P&Z meeting, approve or approve with conditions. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Kyra. Does any commissioners have any questions of Kyra? No? I have one question. On West Pearl, outside of the district that's proposed, there is it's been here as long as I have, there is a bed and breakfast there that has some small boutique, I would say cabins, and I know it's recently been purchased by a realtor here in town who's running it. What you say they're non-conforming. What happens if he tries to sell that property? Then can that ever become, if it's outside the district? Can it ever?
So if it's outside the district and it has an existing SUP, SUP is run with the land, so he could sell that. The new owner could
Just
continue
apply for it.
operations.
Okay, all right, thank you. Any other questions?
Sure.
Go right ahead, Richard.
Kara, first of all, great work for staff. It's a really solid start. I know there's a little bit of polishing to be done yet and public input to be gathered, but we're certainly taking steps in the right direction. Since the permitting process is going to put another requirement and burden on the operators of these small businesses, have we proposed a fee structure for the permit at this time?
Right, so that's really the purview of council, no offense on that. But our initial idea is that would be the same as the existing CO, the certificate of occupancy, which one would have to obtain anyway.
Thank you.
I did have a question in regards to beds versus rooms. And I have limited knowledge of Airbnbs other than staying at a few. And it seems like, you have some that there's bedroom 1, bedroom 2, but then there's a game room that has a fold-out couch where they say, and this is in other areas, where they say, well, there's a bed or a couch that sleeps 2, so the whole place, you could house, 6 people there, even though there's only 2 bedrooms. Is that something that has been considered as far as defining, how many people can actually stay at these places or anything like that?
Right, some ordinance attempt to regulate it based on the number of parties that can stay. The challenge is proving those. So some places have just like a hotel. When you check in, you check in and you declare how many, your name and how many people. The proposal that we have is not set up that way, but if that's something that you'd be interested in pursuing, we can look at that more closely and see if that is a possibility.
Any other questions? All right, at this time, I'll open the public hearing. When you do approach the podium, if you'll please state your full name and your address when you begin your remarks. I have 3 speaker cards. If you wish to speak and you have not turned a speaker card in, if you would please. First up on speaker card, Mr. Peter Garland.
My name is Peter Garland. I live at 511 East Bridge Street in the heart of the bed and breakfast district. Of the 47 that Kira spoke about new bed and breakfast since whatever year, 2015. 9 of them are within 500 feet of my house. 4 of them are directly across the street. I would like to see some kind of density control on this. It is zoned single-family residential and not commercial. These are businesses that people have in here. I'm not objecting to bed and breakfast. I haven't had any problems with the bed and breakfast that have been around me. However, it destroys the neighborhood. It takes family housing off of the market. And what's one of the biggest concerns of the country is housing for families. But you just took 47 houses off of the market and made hotels out of them, actually. In fact, some of the ones across the street from me are labeled as a hotel. It's not a bed and breakfast. But anyways, I would just like to see some kind of quantity control, and also getting back to one of the comments on the sofas and everything like that. There should be a limit on how many people can stay in the house. Sure, you can have a 2-room bed and breakfast, but if you go in some of these, you see the big couches out in the living room, and people just sleep on them. So instead of having 4 people, you got 8 or 12 in the place. Second item I would like to see added to this is parking. Now, there is some kind of a control that the tenants cannot park on the street in public properties. So I would like to see control on parking and the number of units per density. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garland. Next up on the speaker card, Mr. Wayne Mills.
Good evening. My name is Wayne Mills. I live at 629 East Bridge Street, and my questions are pretty much related to that new Article 4.16 that's being proposed. It's my understanding that the city's going to be determining the maximum occupancy for these short-term rental permits, and that they're going to allow 2 people per the number of living areas in the dwelling that's designed and furnished for sleeping, and which has that proper egress as required by the International Residential Code. So if we use an existing approved unhosted bed and breakfast that's in the city right now as an example, and for the sake of argument, we assume that all the rooms are furnished for sleeping, have proper egress. This particular house advertises 2 bedrooms, 2 common areas with beds, an office with a bed, and a sleeper sofa in the living room. So they now have 6 living areas in that dwelling unit that meet the definition of a bedroom for the short-term rental permit. So would we then be giving them a maximum occupancy permit for 12 people? And when they submit the specific use permit, is that going to reflect a 6-unit or 6-guest suite type of unit that's there? And if it does, then that in effect will affect the parking table 11.2D, which says now we've got 6 bedrooms in this 2-bedroom house, because we've got that definition of a bedroom in there. Underneath 4.16.014C, which is the occupant restrictions, currently it states you can only have the maximum of 14 people in an unhosted short-term rental. So I would take that to mean that we won't have any short-term rentals permits that exceed 14 occupancies. However, that same paragraph says that we're going to cap hosted short-term rentals at only 4 people. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Lou James.
Good afternoon. I'm Lou James. I live at 407 Counts Alley. I want to speak strongly in favor of the city's recommendation of continuing this to the next meeting, as exemplified by some of your questions and the information that's been asked here. This was posted online. There was some confusion with the initial material that was posted. It's been corrected, but it was very confusing. A number of my neighbors, I believe, didn't come tonight because they assumed you would continue it. And I think we all need more time to look at it. I agree with Mr. Huffs. I think the city's done an outstanding job with this. It addresses a great many of all of our concerns, but I have some concerns too, some of which may be nitpicking. I know that I read mostly about the residential unhosted, which is what I'm concerned with in my neighborhood. And that does limit it to 3 bedrooms, 2 people per bedroom. And it does define what a bedroom is in a way that would not allow a sleeper sofa to be an additional bedroom. So if this goes through, that will increase the number of bedrooms allowed. Right now, you can only have 2 in a residential unhosted, 2 bedrooms. Also, the language is better. Applications come in listing the number of proposed guest suites, and the zoning ordinance says nothing about guest suites. The zoning ordinance says bedrooms, and at least one application came through. You disapproved it, but it came through, it passed the city. They asked for a 2 guest suite permit, and one of the 2 guest suites had 2 bedrooms. It was 1 guest suite with 2 bedrooms. So for that reason, again, I think they've done a very good job. Most of the definitions are very good. There are lots of minor things, and I think you'll be doing, if you continue it, you'll be doing the city council a big favor, because if you pass this up to them, all of these questions are going to have to come up with the city council. If you continue it, then you all can hash it out with us next month. So, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any others? Are there anyone else would like to speak? If not, I will close the public hearing. Any additional questions? Kara, I would like to state that we might want to hammer out the occupancy in rooms. Possibly, for full disclosure, I own a short-term rental, but I own it in Florida in a different state, and I looked at probably 50 before I bought mine, and some of the ones that I looked at, a bedroom consisted of 4 bunk beds. It looked almost like an army barracks. When we bought our current one, it had a sleeper sofa in the living room. Well, we tossed that in the trash because we didn't want people sleeping on our sofas. But mine is 1,500 square feet. It sleeps 9 in actual beds in bedrooms. But you can get pretty creative with a bedroom when it comes to beds. And so that's something we might need to consider, especially, putting sleepers and fold-out beds and Murphy beds and any kind of room that you can imagine. You can really get the occupancy pretty high in some of these. So I don't know if we term a bedroom, it has to have, a closet and a window. That's kind of the norm, that a bedroom is considered it has to have a closet for clothes and it has to have a window for egress and such. That's just my thoughts on it, so.
Sure, we can look at that.
Okay. All right, the voting options are continue the item to June 13th of 2022 P&Z meeting or approve with conditions. Do I have a motion for either one?
Chair, I'll move to continue to June 13th.
I have a motion for continuance and a second by Mr. Grace. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? The continuance passes.